Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Mythology in Pop Culture. I am one of your hosts, Connor. I'm a library assistant at the Hoover Public Library, and this is my co-host, Melanie. She is a library specialist at the Hoover Public Library, and we're really excited to go over this topic with you guys. So before we really get into the meat and bones of pop culture, and how mythology, especially Norse mythology, has kind of worked itself into our pop culture. I wanted to kind of go over some groundwork, some of the basic players, and some of the mythologies that are well known, taken straight from where we get most of our accounting of the Norse mythology, which is the Prose Edda, at least the translation of the Prose Edda. Um, so to go over some of the, before we go into some of the gods and goddesses that we'll be talking about, I just wanted to mention that we will have time for any questions or any time for questions, and that will be between the two segments. So at the end of mine, which is the basics of mythology, we'll have some questions and answers. And then after pop culture, which will be done by Melanie, she will lay out some questions. We will also be ending at precisely 7:55 because there's going to be maintenance, internet maintenance at this building at 8. So we're going to try and get everything done before then. If things do cut out a little bit before 7:55, don't panic. It's out of our hands, but it's fine. So without further ado, some of the gods and goddesses that premiere heavily within the Norse mythology. There are technically two tribes of gods. You have the Asir and the Vanir. The Asir are primarily war gods, and they are led by Odin, the All-Father. And opposite them are the Vanir, which are more nature, more, spellcaster gods. And they are led by Frey. Now, these two gods began really their relationship with bloodshed. The Asir had welcomed in a witch, a Nordic witch, and she, to the Asir, she had come off as very greedy and very focused on gold, and the Asir took offense to that, so they killed her. The Vanir didn't take kindly to one of theirs entering the hall of the Asir and then being slain. So they decided that they were going to wage war against the Asir. And so they met in combat. And the war was long, the war was bloody, and no one really knew who was going to win. So they decided to make peace. Odin met with Frey, and all of the other Asir and Vanir gathered together. They all spat into a bucket, and they sealed their peace. From that bucket that was filled with the god spittle sprung Kvasir, who is a god of poetry, wisdom, and it was the living embodiment of peace between the Asir and the Vanir. And his story kind of continues later on with one of the other famous myths in the meat of poetry, but we'll kind of go back to that. Some of the other gods that you may know of are primarily from the Asir. They're the ones that most of the stories revolve around, such as Odin, Thor, Loki, and then a few of the others that have premiered throughout television series, books, and things like that are, you have Sif, who is Thor's wife. You have Frigg, who is the wife of Odin. And then you have Heimdall, who is the guardian of the Bifrost. He had a big part in Thor Ragnarok. You have Sigyn, who is Loki's wife, And unfortunately, there's not a lot known about her. There's not many legends, except for one in particular that we get her from. We also have Balder, who's the son of Odin and Frigg. Hoder, who's another son of Odin and Frigg, who is the blind god. And then you have Tyr, who is a god of war, law, and justice. And these are primarily the main gods that pop up throughout most of the Norse mythology. Now, there are a few, primarily 3 gods that are mentioned from the Vanir, and they are Frey, like I mentioned earlier, the leader of the Vanir, Freya, his sister, and then Nahord, who's the god of sea and wealth and is the father of Frey and Freya. And these kind of primarily are the main players within the mythologies. After the War of the Asir and the Vanir, as I mentioned, they created Kvasir. It's spelled Kvasir, I believe. And he is the living embodiment of their peace. And with that, he kind of travels around after being made between the gods and basically teaches people wisdom, runes, their letters, and things like that. He unfortunately does not have a happy ending. He is eventually captured and tricked by 2 dwarfs, Galar and Jalar, and they kill him and use his blood to create a mead of poetry. Whoever drinks it is imbued with great wisdom and the best of words. They always know the right thing to say, and whoever has it is basically a king or has great wealth. And those 2 dwarves keep Kvasir's mead for a very long time until the giant Suntug basically forces them to hand it over, and he kind of goes off. And Odin learns that Suntug, this giant, has the mead of poetry. Well, he can't stand for it, so he goes on a long journey, and through a lot of guile and trickery, he steals the mead back, and he flees. He flees from Suntug in the form of a giant eagle, and he carries most of the mead in his mouth. Well, he does drink some of it, since it's in his mouth, and as it passes through his body, he leaves a dark cloud behind him. And the saying goes that if you're a good poet, you took the best mead from Odin's mouth. Otherwise, well, you got his leftovers. But that's myth for you. To go over a few of the other well-known myths, you have one of the more iconic tools of the gods, Milner, Thor's hammer. He did not always have Milner. It was originally crafted for him due to a plot planned by Loki, the god of mischief, the god of cunning. And in this plot, Loki decided that he would pit 2 dwarven clans against each other to decide who was the best craftsman. And it was between the sons of Ivaldi and Eitri, the great craftsman, and his brother. Whoever won would be the greatest craftsman. The sons of Ivaldi created 3 great masterpieces. Gungnir, which is Odin's spear. I believe they also created Skildbladnir, which is a giant boat that was given to Frey, which always had the best winds and could fold into someone's pocket. So it was a great ship, and it's like a little pocket ship. And they also made Sif, Thor's wife, golden hair to replace hair that she had lost earlier. Eitri created a golden bristled boar. He then created a ring that you could wear on the arm that would multiply, I believe at each night. But it was a ring that basically produced as much gold, an infinite amount of gold each night. And then the last was Milner. However, when forging Milner, Eitri, his brother, who was pumping the bellows to create the heat, and it was supposed to be a very specific heat for Milner, was bitten on the nose by a fly. Many assume that that fly was Loki in order to cheat in the bet. And due to this, he messes with the heat just enough where Milner is imperfect. That's why you see it with a very short, tiny handle. It's supposed to be a very long, full-fledged hammer, war hammer, that you could swing with two hands. Instead, it's just one little nub. And it's why Thor needs great iron gauntlets to pick it up, because it doesn't have enough grip to hold on to. So that's how Milner is formed, through this bet with Loki. Unfortunately, Loki is the cause of many great triumphs of the gods, but he's also usually their downfall, especially during Ragnarok, which is their end times. So that's some basic lore, some basic information on some of the main gods within their mythology. A lot of the information that I got for this presentation is from the Prose Edda, through some of their translations. I also used Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology. He has a great collection, very well written. I also use this book called Norse Mythology, by Kevin Costley Holland. It, again, is a great source of information if you are more interested in some of these myths. I did paraphrase a lot, and just due to time, because a lot of these stories really go into the workings of the gods. They really show the different aspects of who these Norse deities were. And in a lot of senses, it reflects on who the Norse people were. So now I'm going to open up the floor to all of you. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you look below under reactions, if you click on that, you can raise a hand or raise a thumb, and we will call on you. But to start, I do have a question on what are some of your favorite Norse myths, and why do they stand out to you?
I guess I'll go ahead and answer that first question, get the party started. So I think that my favorite story from Norse mythology is probably the building of the wall of Asgard. It's just kind of a funny story. There's a unnamed giant, I believe, that comes and says he can build a wall for Odin. He wants to build a wall around Asgard to keep out the frost giants. And it's going to be like a huge feat, but this guy's like, I can do it in like a week or something like that. And he says that he wants a couple things as payment. One of them is marriage to Freya, who's the goddess of, love and beauty and all that stuff. Everybody wants to marry Freya. And he has this like magical horse that can like carry infinite amounts of stone. And so, he's building this wall, and he looks like he's actually going to do it in time. And the gods are like, oh, wait, we can't let this guy actually do what he said. We can't give him Freya. So Loki transforms himself into a beautiful mare and distracts the giant's horse and cheats, basically makes it so that, he doesn't complete the wall exactly in time. But Loki, as the mayor, gets pregnant, and that brings about Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse. So it's kind of it's an interesting myth. But yeah, so what are some of your favorite myths and stories? We got one in the chat. Thor dressing as Freya to trick giants and get his hammer back. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. I don't know how they passed Thor off as a bride. I think I remember he ate an entire ox at the wedding party, and I think Loki was just kind of telling them like, oh, she's just so excited. She hasn't eaten for 7 days. That's why she's starving. And, just kind of coming up with these crazy excuses for why Thor is so robust and unladylike. But yeah. Omaki down in the chat also is mentioning Odin sacrificing his eye. That's a good story too. Connor, do you know more about that one? It's been a while since I've read that one.
If I remember correctly, Odin seeks the head of Mimir, who had his head chopped off actually by the Vanir due to the exchange of I guess permanent prisoners. Freya and Frey went from the Vanir to the Asir. The Asir sent over Hanir and Mimir. Once Mimir disappeared for a little bit, Hanir became very unleaderish and very difficult to handle, difficult to deal with, and they took that as an insult. And so they cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to the Asir. Odin then took his head, smeared it with ceremonial herbs and spices so it would not rot, and then gave it back its speech through magic and placed it into, I forget the exact name of the pond, but it's basically the river that flows through all 9 worlds. And at the base, it pools. He placed that head into the pool of knowledge, and Mimir became the guardian of it and continues to speak wisdom. Odin went to Mimir and asked for a drink from this pool of infinite wisdom. And Mimir basically told him, you have to give me something in exchange. This wisdom cannot go without a sacrifice. And he told Odin that you would have to give him his eye. So Odin cut out his own eye, placed it into the river for a drink. And since then, Odin was imbued with knowledge and wisdom. And it's interesting because Odin usually gets some kind of item, some kind of drink, like the mead of Kvasir, in order to imbue himself with knowledge. And oftentimes, it's usually at a price in the case of the eye. Another instance of this is when Odin hangs himself from Yggdrasil, pierces his own side, I believe, with a spear, and then hangs there, I believe, for 3 days. It may have been longer, in order to gain more knowledge. At the end of his suffering, the runes of the world, that basically the language of the multiverse, revealed themselves to him, and that is how he learned of the runes. So yeah, usually in Norse mythology, if you want to learn something, you usually have to pay a pretty steep price for it. Yeah, that is a good story. That's a very, very good story. I guess we'll move on to the next question. What have you all gained from reading mythology? What has mythology played? What part has it played in your lives? I guess I'll start this one off. For me, mythology is, I mean, it's a connection to the past for certain, but I think it's also a reflection of who we are as people. A lot of my interpretations of mythology generally come from the Joseph Campbell and his Hero with a Thousand Faces. how we each have to take the journey that these heroes throughout time and through different cultures have to take within ourselves. And so for me, I see a lot of who we are as a people within mythology. And I've grown up with mythology. So it's always been a very strong impact on my life. Granted, I think one should take some mythology with a grain of salt and take them as lessons. Not saying you should emulate some of the gods, especially some of those Olympians. They were kind of difficult to deal with.
There were a lot.
They were a whole lot. But for me, that's what mythology has played in my life. So I want to hear from you guys. What have you gained from reading mythology?
Omaki down in the chat says, culturally, it's interesting to look at mythologies as insight to different places and times. So yeah, we can learn a lot about cultures that are long gone just from their stories, their belief systems. And it's unfortunate that a lot of Norse mythology has been kind of lost. We have two major sources. One of them was Snorri Sturluson. Yeah. But he was a Christian who was like kind of reinterpreting these stories or putting them together. So it's kind of like, not going to be the most, I guess, accurate representation. And a lot of oral histories and traditions are lost to us, unfortunately. But the little bits that we can get are really interesting and do give us a lot of insight. 9 down in the chat says, Odin taught me just now that ignorance is bliss and less debilitating. I mean, that is definitely a lesson you could take. Odin does seem to keep losing bits of himself in pursuit of knowledge. One thing that I think I have kind of gleaned from Norse mythology in particular is that, thinking about Loki and how he has done a lot of things that helped the gods and also harmed the gods, and you're never really sure where he stands. Bad people can do good things, and people can do bad things, and nobody's perfect. And I guess Odin is supposed to be this really wise character, but he can also be cruel. He's a leader, but and he does a lot of good and looks after humanity, but he can also be very cruel. And Thor is he's our big hero, but he's kind of a dunderhead. At least in the original Norse mythology, he's always he's very loud and brash and rude and getting into trouble all the time and bragging, and he's definitely not a humble character. So we've got these heroes and these gods that are very flawed, and I guess that's comforting in a way. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that actually leads very into Amaki, what they were saying. Those figures embody a lot of what people consider the most important lessons and interpretations of the world, comparing different mythologies and seeing similarities show how real humans are still humans. I definitely agree with that. I think with a lot of these mythologies, a lot of what people imagined and how these stories kind of grew is they had to base it on something. And what they knew was the harsh environment of their world and each other. And so you have very much the capacity for great good and great compassion, great leadership. And then you also have that side that is truly ruthless. So it's interesting. It's very interesting.
Madeline says, myth and folklore have always served as cautionary tales for me. I also see the sense of community and how these stories are passed through the generations. I don't think we get the same experience in our society today. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, it's just different. That's very true. I think that a lot of our kind of storytelling now is through movies and TV and other media. And it's kind of, more mass market rather than like small communities that, really know each other and are passing down these stories. So it is very different. It kind of makes me wonder what people centuries from now are going to see when they look back on us. But Omaki also wanted to know what our favorite Norse Norse characters are. So you first, Connor.
Oh, me first?
Yeah.
That is a tricky question. To me, one of the characters that really stands out the most is Tyr, who is the god of war, law, and justice. He also loses a hand. And I didn't go over this particular myth, but it happened during the binding of Fenrir. The gods had tried to bind Fenrir with normal iron chains, bigger and larger links. Each time Fenrir is too strong, he breaks out of them. So eventually they go to the dwarves and they ask them to make something that is unbreakable. And the dwarves make a chain of paradoxes, such as the sound of a cat, the beard of a woman, the root of a mountain, and the spittle of a bird. And these things are so contradictory that they can never be broken. And when Fenrir sees this binding, he doesn't want to be bound. But they basically challenge him and they ask, will you break these? You said you're so strong, Fenrir. Break these chains like you've broken all the others. So he agrees, but on a condition that someone will place their hand inside of his mouth. And if someone does this, and when they are finished, that they will unbind him. If he cannot break it, then he would allow it. None of the gods wanted to put their hand inside of Fenrir's mouth for good reason. He was a very large wolf. But Tyr volunteers. He says that he would allow his hand to be held as ransom. And Fenrir can't break the bonds. And so afterwards, he asked the gods to release him as they promised. And they don't. So at this point, Tyr could have yanked his hand back. He could have pleaded with Fenrir or try to make a deal. Instead, he allows Fenrir to bite his hand off. And to me, I think that's a pretty big statement, especially when you have these gods of Loki and Odin who seem to be able to weasel their way out of any bargain or bend the rules just right to get out of almost anything. But then you have Tyr who allows his hand to be ripped off because of his word. And I think that makes a pretty big statement. So Tyr's my favorite.
He's the god of war, but also like truth and justice, isn't he?
Law and justice, yes.
Yeah. It seems like he would his actions speak to his character and what he is known for, I guess. So
definitely.
Good on him. I think he has to be one of my favorites too. Just for that story. I mean, we don't know a whole lot else about him, other than I think he gives Loki some clap back when he's doing his flighting at dinner one time. I can't remember which story that was, but basically Loki is like talking smack to everybody, and I think Tyr throws one back at him. But other than that, I don't know a whole lot about Tyr other than that story. And I have to say, it's a good story. I think that we don't know a whole lot about Loki's wife, but and I can never pronounce her name. Sigyn?
I think it's Sigyn. Sigyn.
Sigyn.
It's Sigyn.
I like her as a character, even though we don't really know a whole lot about her, but other than, what she's famous for, which is after Loki is bound after the murder of Balder, he's basically sentenced to torment forever. There's a snake that's dripping poison onto his face for eternity. And his faithful wife, even though Loki's been disgraced and bound, she goes and holds a bowl over Loki's face and catches the poison. That's some dedication. Get you a wife like that. And then the myth also goes to say that, every once in a while the bowl gets full and she has to go and dump it out. And when she leaves, the poison drips on Loki's face and he writhes in pain, and that's how we get earthquakes. So myths are wild. But really, as far as like lesser known characters, I think Sigyn is one of my favorites. And back in the chat, Omaki mentions that kind of going back on what we were talking about earlier as far as mythology and how it's kind of changed in the modern day. I certainly don't think we have the epic tales as back in the day, but part of that is because the only way to teach those old lessons was to tell the stories over and over. I'd say if you want to look at modern day larger than life figures teaching lessons, I'd say look to some of the better cartoons. Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's hard to pick favorites from mythology because there's a lot of drama. Myth people are problematic. That's very true.
They really, really are. Well, since we're actually talking about cartoons, Melanie, do you want to kick it off for our segue into how mythology is kind of impacted pop culture?
Yeah, I do want to go ahead and mention in the chat. Nine also has said that they like the squirrel Ratatosker, who seems to just be the messenger of smack talk between the dragon and the eagle on the world tree. Yeah, forgot about that one. Yeah, that's a pretty good one. We didn't mention this, my favorite mode of transportation among the Asgardians would be, I think, Frigg's chariot drawn by cats. We didn't bring that up, so I had to mention it. I want me a chariot drawn by giant cats. That's the way to travel right there. But yeah, so kind of going into Norse mythology and its impact on popular culture. Wow. Norse mythology has influenced creative works from books to comics to video games and music. And I'm here to talk about just some of them. But first, let's talk a little bit about why these stories have persisted. We've kind of talked a little bit about that in the chat. But like a lot of Norse mythology in particular is pretty dark, does not have happy endings. Neil Gaiman said in a 2018 interview for The Independent, there's nothing shiny about Norse myths. They're stories about a cold, inhospitable place where the best thing you can imagine is to be killed in battle. So the entire mythology centers on an endless cycle of cataclysmic destruction and renewal, the world destroyed in a wash of blood and flame, with life re-emerging from the ashes and beginning anew. Ragnarok and rebirth. It's not the most cheerful story or belief system. And yet there is some appeal to it. If you've been drawing something and you keep trying to fix it and it just keeps getting smudged and, you just can't do anything with it anymore, and then you just rip it out and throw it out and start with a clean new page. That's kind of how I picture Ragnarok. Everything gets so messy and then you just, okay, we're starting over, new world. And also in a lot of the stories of Norse mythology, there's a lot of mischief and humor along the way. Despite the kind of overall grimness, there's very much an attitude of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And this mentality makes for some great stories and great heroes. So I'm going to kind of start off talking about books, and I'm only going to talk about some of the more well-known ones. If you think of others, feel free to drop them in the chat. So here we go. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and the Legend of Sigurd and Godren by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is probably one of the most well-known examples of fiction influenced by Norse mythology. Tolkien was an avid scholar of Germanic and Scandinavian mythology and drew from those studies as he wrote his epic fantasies. Trolls, elves, and dwarves are a few examples of creatures that he took from these tales. We didn't really talk a whole lot about the 9 realms, but he did draw from there. Let's see. And, due to Tolkien's influence on high fantasy as a genre, many fantasy books regularly feature slight influences from Norse mythology. If you've got dwarves and elves and trolls in your fantasy story, you've been drawing a little bit from Norse mythology, whether you know it or not. The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun takes from the legends of Sigurd and the fall of the Niflungs in Norse mythology, written in verse inspired by the poetic Edda. Gandalf is obviously inspired by Odin. The Balrog probably takes inspiration from the giants Surtur. The races of men in The Lord of the Rings, Gondor, Rohan, heavily based on Norse and Scandinavian culture. So there are whole, books written about this. So if you ever want to look up more into Norse mythology and J.R.R. Tolkien and, how that influenced his writings, there are plenty of books on it. Moving on a little bit, we've got Neil Gaiman. It is almost impossible to talk about Norse mythology in media today without talking about Neil Gaiman. The man loves Norse mythology. So many of his works touch on it. He wrote, as Connor mentioned earlier, Norse mythology is kind of Gaiman's retelling of popular Norse tales, including, the theft of Thor's hammer, the capture of Fenrir, and other tales of the Aesir. If you want to learn more about some of the original stories but don't actually want to read the poetic or the prose Edda, you can check this book out. It's kind of like Norse mythology light. Then he's also got a children's book, Odd and the Frost Giants, about a young Norseman who has a run-in with Odin, Loki, and Thor and helps them retrieve Thor's hammer from a frost giant. Kind of takes a little bit from the Lay of Thrym and the building of the Wall of Asgard. Then you've got American Gods, one of the most popular fiction stories with a modern take on the gods of Norse mythology. Odin played a major part in the story, or at least a version of Odin does. If you haven't read the books or the graphic novel or seen the TV series, I highly recommend it. Excellent mashup of mythology in the modern day. And someone mentioned in the chat, the Sandman comics, yes. Loki, Odin, and Thor, I believe, all make appearances at various points in this series. And I don't want to get too much into all of this spoilers and stuff like that, so I'm keeping it kind of light. But let's see. Magnus Chase by Rick Riordan. This series is similar to Rick Riordan's famous Percy Jackson series, but centers around Norse mythology. With some crossover to his other series. If you haven't read either series, basically the stories usually center around modern-day teens who find out that one of their parents was a god in whatever pantheon, making them a demigod, and they get introduced to this hidden magical world around them. Monsters, epic battles, and sinister plots inevitably ensue. Magnus Chase is a little unique in that the titular hero of this series starts by dying heroically and being sent to Valhalla, where his adventures begin. Odin, Thor, Loki, the Valkyries, and more Norse characters and creatures make appearances. And while the series is meant for children, it's pretty obvious that Riordan did his research when writing these books. Bits and pieces from the old stories are evident all throughout. Even lesser known characters that don't get brought into a lot of other modern retellings, like Mimir. Mimir shows up in Magnus Chase. And Scotty shows up in Magnus Chase. There's a bunch of interesting little characters that don't really make it into a lot of other mainstream reinterpretations. Let's see. I also feel like he did a pretty good job of characterization of many of the gods, especially Thor and Loki. Let's see. We've also got The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson. This is a book from kind of the 1950s, set in Viking time and heavily influenced by Norse mythology, inspired by sagas and containing many Norse gods, elves, and trolls as characters. It's something of a fantasy classic. I haven't read it, but it's been recommended to me several times. And there are just tons and tons of other books. I'm not going to, list them all out, but if you've got a favorite one, please, drop it in the chat. So we're gonna kind of move on to comics. Thor by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Obviously, this is going to be one of the best known adaptations of Norse myths in the modern world. It takes a lot of liberties, but it's been very popular, especially lately with the Marvel Cinematic Universe coming out. I have to say, I kind of like the premise of the story where Thor is banished to Earth to learn humility, something that OG Thor probably could have taken a dose of. And it's, it's a pretty wild story. Like, I've tried to kind of delve into the Marvel Thor comics. There's just a lot there. But other comics that kind of take from Norse mythology would be Ragnarok by Jin Lee. This is a Korean manga or manhwa based around Norse mythology as well as other cultures. It centers around a character named Chaos, who is a reincarnation of the god Balder. Fenrir is a sorceress looking for him in order to bring about Ragnarok. Loki and other characters make an appearance. It's pretty loosely based on the mythology, but I kind of like it in that it follows Balder, who we don't really get a lot from in the original mythology outside of his tragic demise. So it's nice to see Balder get some attention. And, it's a fun romp if you're into that sort of thing. Kind of reminds me a lot of, so many anime set in fantasy worlds. But then there's also Mythical Detective Loki Ragnarok. This anime/manga borrows very loosely from Norse mythology and centers around Loki, in kind of a reverse of Thor by Stan Lee. It's Loki who is banished to the human realms to learn some sort of lesson, and for extra anime weirdness, he's turned into a child. He's supposed to collect darkness from human hearts so he can go home, so he starts a paranormal detective agency to help him with his mission. And, they have a slew of other characters from the Norse pantheon that show up as well. So there's people reinterpret these myths in all kinds of different and interesting ways. Kind of moving on to movies and TV, we've got, of course, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, based on the comics by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This series portrays the Asgardians as a race of aliens rather than gods, and they're super long-lived and technologically way advanced, while also kind of seeming sort of rustic in their everyday life in that old Norse Viking kind of way. And they're not the only group to kind of reinterpret the Asgardians as an alien race. Stargate SG-1 did that in their TV series. There's a lot of other movies and TV out there that, touch on Norse mythology. We've got, the new American Gods series, which we talked about earlier with Neil Gaiman, Vikings, Norsemen, and Ragnarok, which came out this year on Netflix. So if you've got any other that you really like, please drop them in the comments. And someone did ask, do the Wagner operas count as pop culture? I would say yes. They're still very relevant even today. And yes, Wagner's The Ring des Nibelungen, I'm not sure how to say that. The Ring of Nibelungen is a series of 4 operas that were loosely based on Norse characters. There's Das Rheingold, the Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. I'm not even going to pretend like I probably said that right. So yes, that is Something that also influenced Tolkien a little bit. He was, listening to these operas way back in the day, and borrowed a little bit from them as well when he was writing Lord of the Rings. So good call out there. Other music that's kind of been influenced by Norse mythology, obviously, like the Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin, with its lyrics, "We come from the land of ice and snow, from the midnight sun where hot springs flow. The hammer of the gods will drive our ships to new lands to fight the horde and sing and cry, Valhalla, I am coming." I mean, there you go. And then there's like a whole genre of Viking music. Viking metal. It's a style of heavy metal music that has a thematic focus on Norse mythology, Norse paganism, and the Viking Age. It's described as kind of a subgenre of black metal that leads towards paganism rather than Satanism. A couple of examples are Amon Amarth, Tyr, Wardruna, Man of War, Sons of Odin. I really like Wardruna. They're a Norwegian band dedicated to creating music based in Norse culture and tradition, and they use a lot of like traditional and historic instruments, so it's kind of interesting and a little less, so I like it a little more. But yeah, so there's a lot, and we're kind of running short on time here, and I want to leave some room for questions, so I'm just going to kind of briefly go over a couple of other hints of Norse culture and mythology and media today. If anybody's seen, She-Ra, She-Ra's character design looks a lot like a Valkyrie. Loki pops up as either a villain or a morally ambiguous trickster in all kinds of TV shows and movies. Supernatural, Hercules: The Legendary Journeys, Stargate SG-1. Thor pops up in a lot of those too. And Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think they both make an appearance in there. How to Train Your Dragon is based on Viking culture. The North in Game of Thrones is very similar to a lot of Scandinavian culture. And, the wall built to keep out creatures of ice and other monsters is very similar to the wall of Asgard, built to keep the frost giants out. Hans Christian Andersen's tale, The Snow Queen, which inspired Disney's Frozen, was in turn probably inspired by Scandinavian characters such as Skadi. And she may have been an influence on C.S. Lewis's character, the White Witch, in the Chronicles of Narnia. And given C.S. Lewis's friendship with Tolkien, they probably talked a lot about, those kinds of myths together. So I don't think that's too far-fetched. But yeah, so there's just, it's all over the place, even today. So kind of talking a little bit with you guys, I wanted to know, what are some of your favorite books, movies, TV series, etc., that borrow from Norse mythology?
I guess I'll start off. You actually mentioned probably some of my favorite books. I grew up reading the Percy Jackson books, and when Magnus Chase came out, I was really, really, really excited, and I kind of dug into those heavily. I also grew up reading The Lord of the Rings. I remember going to sleep to The Lord of the Rings. I had a complete box set. And the more I read The Lord of the Rings, and then the more I read the Norse mythology, the parallels are uncanny, truly, especially with the Hobbit, with the One Ring of Power, and then you have Smaug and all that gold, which is very reminiscent of the ring. A dwarf had a ring and a large stack of gold. You had to have the ring to get the gold, and it was stolen from him, and the curse of the gold turned him into a dragon, where he sat to guard his treasure. So it's lots of commonality, but those are probably some of my favorite stories that have been influenced by Norse mythology. What about anyone else? Replying to Sarah.
Yeah. I haven't heard of Donheim. I was know a little more about it. And I guess my favorite that has borrowed from Norse mythology, other than the ones that, you know, you've already mentioned, you got me onto Magnus Chase. And of course, I love Lord of the Rings. I really, really enjoyed American Gods, which you need to read.
I will.
It's kind of, you know, it's not just Norse mythology. There's a huge mashup of many other cultures and beliefs. But Odin plays a pretty major role, and I really loved their kind of take on, you know, mythology and beliefs in the modern world. Like, I don't know if y'all know a whole lot about it. The gods from, you know, old worlds, you know, Europe, have kind of traveled with immigrants into America, but they're kind of like, you know, different versions of themselves because they've kind of transformed over time as, you know, beliefs have changed. And also, since a lot of old myths and religions are dying out, they've lost a lot of their power, and it kind of follows that sort of story. And the rise of new gods in the form of media, like there's like a television god and a couple other ones, social media and stuff like that. It's very interesting. Let's see. Head Lopper, the comic series. I haven't seen that one either. And Danheim is a popular Viking atmospheric band. Oh, okay. So a band done by some guy in Denmark. Okay. Takes inspiration from traditional music and stories. Cool. The Dresden Files. Connor, you can talk about that since you mentioned it.
So the Norse mythology, it doesn't focus around Norse mythology. It actually focuses on a wizard, a modern urban wizard named Harry Dresden. However, as he kind of gets more and more entangled with the underbelly of Chicago's supernatural world, bigger and bigger players kind of pop up. Not only the fairy queens of Mab and Titania, but also with Odin, Einarjar, which are the warriors, the honored dead who are welcomed into Valhalla after dying in glorious combat, and even his Valkyries. So they're not constant characters, but the author, Jim Butcher, was definitely influenced by a lot of mythology, including Norse mythology, and they're well worth the read.
All right. So we're kind of running short on time here. I did want to ask one more question at least. Let's see, which one do I want to ask? Are there any lesser known characters from Norse mythology that often get left out of modern retellings that you would like to see brought into new stories? Most stories center around, you know, the big three, Odin, Thor, and Loki. Are there any other characters y'all would like to see more of in modern retellings of these stories? Balder.
It seems if you're not Odin, Thor, or Loki, or directly associated with one of Loki's pranks, you usually don't get a big shout out, because it's mentioned that there are many gods of the Asir and of the Vanir, and there's only 3 Vanir gods that show up. And in fact, I think there's more giants that are named than there are Norse deities or the gods of men. So I would like to hear some, maybe even imposing some new gods that fit into that pantheon. Vidar. I hadn't even thought of Vidar.
Is that one of Odin's brothers?
I think maybe. That's a good one. I think
He may have. I know Skadi was also like a goddess of skiing, but I'm not sure if she invented it or if that was.
He survives Ragnarok. He is one of the younger generations that actually survives Ragnarok, and that's right. So he would be one of the sons of Odin.
Sons of Odin. Okay.
Is he the son of Odin?
Yes, he kills Fenrir after Odin bites it.
Yes, because Thor kills Jormungand but dies from the poison. Odin kills Fenrir kills Odin, but then Vidar shatters his jaw and pierces his heart.
Well,
Happy times,
that's
right?
revenge.
I will say though, even though it's all dark and gloom and there is a Ragnarok that kills most people, humans do survive from basically a man and a woman survive hiding in the branches of Yggdrasil along with many of the gods, and they kind of rebuild the worlds, which I think is a fairly optimistic approach, especially when you have this foretold doom of all these characters. Even Odin, and this is again the Prose Edda, which is written by Snorri Sturluson, says that he will return at some point. Unfortunately, I believe we're just about out of time.
Bye.
Melanie, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Well, we wanted to thank everybody for coming to our panel. Please let us know in the comments if you enjoyed it, if you'd like to hear more about other mythologies in the future. And enjoy the rest of Hoover Library's first ever virtual Sci-Fi Fantasy Fest. We've got a host of other panels for you to enjoy. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.